Hey, everybody. Our next episode now with some familiar faces. Bryant Thomas to my right here, a longtime journalist, most recently with the AP News Bureau in Washington, D.C., and John Woodford, also a longtime observer of social conditions, a civil rights advocate, an editor, and a reporter for some major publications over the years, now in Michigan. Now, guys, today's topic is CNN's ouster of Jeff Zucker, the head of CNN, and what was really involved in that. And are we getting the full story? Now, the cover, what I think is a cover story is that he was ousted because of a unreported dalliance with one of his other co-workers, marketing chief Allison Gollust. Now, from all reports, this was an open secret for years, not only at CNN, but throughout the media generally. So I think, that was really a surface reason for firing him. I think it goes much deeper than that. So guys, take it away from here. What's your speculation? What's really happening at CNN?
Go ahead, John.
Well, since you alerted me to the topic, I learned a lot more about this thing than I knew before. And as much as I could grasp, because it really has to do with, to me, intrigue among very wealthy corporations vying for, they're merging. Some guys who are with one part of the company get eased out because there's only room, like they're struggling for power and riches. Meanwhile, like Warner Discovery, which is going to take over CNN, they're competing with Fox, which has its own stuff going on. So I think this guy, he was the one who made CNN like what it became, with this array of talking heads of a certain type that he nurtured, and they all came to his defense. But I think what he got caught with was when they had to get rid of Chris Cuomo for using the news in his position to help out his brother, the governor.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that Chris Cuomo knew enough, they say, and I believe it, he knew enough to put a little depth charge against Zucker. And they could use that, those who wanted to get rid of Zucker, to have him resign. On the other hand, I see some people say that, watch out, Zucker is likely to emerge in the reconfigured Warner later on this year. So we don't know what's going to happen. But the main thing, I think, is that, all these people have tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars that they've been getting running these places. And if they're considered not competitive and not earning enough profit, then they know that some reason or another can be used to unseat them. And I think that's probably what happened to Zucker. I don't think it really has anything to do, the sex stuff is a good club that you can beat people with when you need it, if you can't get something else. And he had to leave. And also, when you leave that way, you don't get the same kind of severance. So if you're in the company and are concerned about the fact that it's losing money and is in a precarious position, if you can get rid of a person and not have to give him that golden parachute, you save a chunk. That's a feather in your cap. We have the same thing here at University of Michigan. They just made the president leave because he had a girlfriend. He's married, but his wife is in California, and the poor lonely guy had a girlfriend and she was in development. But anyway, he was too dumb to use a separate email system. So when it came time they were going to ease them out, he would have had a golden parachute, the likes of which would match anyone in a corporation. But they could use this sex thing to strip him and get him out and save themselves the golden parachute.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up, because we had a president who was an admitted bad boy, even in his public statements, and it completely rolled off his back. It didn't matter to voters. He's right about one thing, I could shoot somebody in Central Park and it wouldn't change my popularity. And that's the living truth. And yet on the same plane, they drive Al Franken from the Senate for that silly little prank that he did during a video. And they drive him out of the Senate entirely while Trump is sitting there doing things that were 10 times worse. So you're right. I think it's more than that. I think it's something that is involving what CNN would like to become in terms of what it used to be. In other words, go back to what they were doing, and that is hard news 24 hours a day rather than the talking head format that they have.
In fact, the CEO of the Discovery that they'll be merging with has said a number of times publicly in the past year that he'd like to see CNN get back to its original mission of news and not political commentary. He said that the CNN is the left wing of the media. So I think, and I don't think that's because he's of high principles. I think it's just practicality. Because don't forget, according to all reports, CNN's ratings have dropped like 80–90%. I don't know if that's accurate, but if even it's anywhere near close, that's a precipitous drop. And I think it's because they played up politics too much. I mean, they were so obviously slanted. I'm not saying Fox News isn't, Bryant, but they were so obviously slanted that people got sick of that, and the ratings dropped because of it. So,
well, I'm not so sure that was the reason, because Fox is mining this for everything they can, and there's nothing wrong with their ratings. So I don't know if I agree with that.
No, I think it's because CNN was so politically correct all the time and so woke and progressive to an extreme, and that's not selling with the public. That's why the ratings have dropped. Fox is on the other side of it, and its shtick sells with the public. So I think their drop in their ratings was directly related to their ultra liberalism and the talking heads that they had. Also, it centers on Chris Cuomo having his brother on the air all the time, which was a breach of ethics, clearly journalistic ethics, and it was approved by Zucker. And in fact, Alison Gallus has her own baggage because according to reports, she and Zucker were both in contact directly with Andrew Cuomo, the governor, and coaching him on how to appear favorably in the media. So what Chris Cuomo is doing now is saying that, look, you asked me for something like that. These guys were doing it too. They gave me permission. They were encouraging it, and they were doing it themselves. So, but what I'd really like to focus on is what this says about what the media has become. From the days when we've all been in journalism our entire lives, the three of us here, and when we started out, it wasn't like that, or at least it wasn't so obvious, hitting you over the head with it. People always had their own strong opinions, but it didn't come out in what was presented as straight news reports. That's all changed now. As I've said repeatedly, the media now have become largely cheerleaders and propagandists, and this is case in point with CNN.
Well, I think here's what I think. When you and I grew up, there was the evening news. And don't forget, not everybody among the three major networks had an evening newscast for a while.
Right.
They all kind of staggered in. So that set the stage for what you and I used to get our news from in the evening. And that was to turn on the TV at 6:30 or 6 o'clock, whenever you got the broadcast, and get updated on national news events. All of the news channels that we have on satellite now have changed that whole game. And there's so many places, in addition to on air and online services, where you can get news, that I don't think there's any way you can put this genie back in the bottle. I just don't see that.
Yeah, well, don't forget, Jen Psaki and other White House officials are urging networks to crack down on, quote, disinformation and misinformation. I mean, again, another assault on the First Amendment. They should be completely out of it, even giving any kind of verbal statement on that, well, we should, these networks should bring back, should increase efforts to propagate only correct news. I mean, this is another step towards getting away from the mission the traditional original mission of the media as a watchdog and shaping it. I see this more and more going on. And what surprises me, maybe not surprises me, but it is that there's so little reaction within the media to what's going on because they've all been compromised, the way I see it.
What do you think, John?
Well, these media are just huge monopoly corporations,
Right.
and they're trying to, I think that what Chomsky and that guy published the book Manufacturing Consent, The Role in Society, on one level is to manufacture the consent of the public. On the other hand, there are a lot of people working in the media who may not be going along with it or have other kind of principles. So there's a tension, but the tension comes out only if there's something going on in the world, like a war, in which, let's say, the powers that be were trying to get us to support the Vietnam War for a while. But as more news people began to say, hey, and try to get their stories covered, there was a competition between a lot of the papers and the networks, so that when Seymour Hersh, for example, with the Malaya Massacre, the New York Times wasn't going to publish it. He had enough goods on it that they were afraid that he could go and publish it elsewhere and they would look bad. And sometimes there have been reporters who had that kind of leverage and who used it. Of course, a lot of times they wouldn't send someone to cover something in a way. I know of many cases at the New York Times where if the reporter was going to cover stuff in a different way, let's say like the Nicaraguan situation in the Contras, if you weren't on board because they debriefed all the reporters in Washington when they came back, and so they're kind of part of the power structure, you wouldn't be a foreign correspondent. It was hard to be a foreign correspondent if you were too far outside what was going to be accepted. But some guys and girls weren't as controllable as others, and they might take their shot. And that's what he did with the My Lai massacre. And he used that leverage, and he did it elsewhere too. Seymour Hersh is a great journalist, but most aren't like him.
Yeah, I think those days are long gone. I mean, look at the Russian collusion bit that was pushed during all 4 years of the Trump administration. I mean, it had no substance. All these investigations, nothing came of it, and that was a narrative that was pushed by mainstream media. So you don't have independent journalists. There may be some out there, but they don't have platforms anymore.
But now they'd be called. Jen Psaki would call a person an un-American if he or she published the Russian story the way they didn't like it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and everything now is being labeled an insurrection. The Canadian truckers now, it's an insurrection. So again, they're using all these terms, generalizing, painting everybody with a broad brush, and now any kind of dissent in the future is going to be labeled quickly an insurrection. So you're an insurrectionist, you're a terrorist, and the media is using these labels. I mean,
misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. They're coming up with buzzwords. I mean, Orwell would have a ball with it because they have come up with these so that dissent is un-American or treasonous. So they're implying,
I mean, this is an effort, a unified effort. The media is going along with, because as you say, of all the corporate ties, and the corporations are tied in with the politicians. They fund their campaigns, then they get payback. So this is a frontal unified assault on crushing dissent. So you only get the party line, and that's what's a cause for extreme alarm that nobody's paying attention to.
I agree. Yeah.
Brian, you probably have somewhat of a different opinion on this.
Yeah, I don't think we're as far down the road as you think we are. I think that after 4 years of Trump and all of his nonsense, you're going to see a swing back to the other side of the pendulum. And this is probably what you're seeing. Now, are there going to be excesses along the way? Of course, there were excesses with Trump. So I don't know where the pendulum is going to stop, but I do know that it's reaction and action at work here. And I can only hope and pray that saner heads will prevail, and we get off the merry-go-round of constantly having to label people and call them bad names simply because they disagree.
I mean, can either of you imagine when we started out in journalism that an anchor on a major media outlet would be allowed to repeatedly interview his brother, who was a governor of a state, and softball questions, and that would be approved, and nobody would found that unethical or even strange. And yet, I mean, we came to that point at CNN, which shows you how far we've drifted from traditional journalistic values and ethics. I mean,
I agree. I think the Cuomo connection there was questionable at best.
Questionable.
At best.
Thing is, if you're going to go against Fox, if you really were liberal, because I don't think of these CNN type upper level people as really all that liberal, but if you were, you would have to compete against Fox effectively.
Mhm.
Why can't you describe to people what you want to cover in a way that appeals to them and that they can understand? Most of the stuff that they, I can hardly take looking at CNN anymore. When I remember they had Chris Cuomo, Don Lemon brought Chris Cuomo on. What was the name of the woman from Hawaii who was running for president for a while?
Tulsi Gabbard.
Tulsi Gabbard, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So on certain topics, Tulsi was really quite interesting and strong. She wasn't a warmonger, and also she was taking a different line on with Syria, I think it was.
Yeah.
Maybe that was the topic, and some other things. So she was Don Lemon wasn't able to handle her in his interview. She knew more than he did, and so he called in Chris Cuomo, and then they both kind of double teamed, and basically they were just insulting her, saying they weren't really responding to any of the substantive things that she was saying, and that's it ticked me off so much that I could hardly look at either one of them after that. I think I wrote something in to her campaign. She responded to. She agreed. Yeah, they just they jumped all over her, and that's what now we see with Jen Psaki and these others. That's their mode now.
Yeah.
If you don't go along with it, now I'm against I don't like what the Fox people are doing, but I can say at least they're effective. The guy who does Dilbert, what's his name? Scott something or other. Anyway, I saw him once on one of those late night shows, and he said that he said he knew communication, molding public opinion through language. This was something that interested him, and that he would like to advise the Democrats how they could be a lot better at it. They could be come back at Fox with their own game. And he volunteered on that show. He said, if they just have to ask me, and I'll come in and consult with them for nothing. No one ever asked him to come in. I would say to me, that shows how stupid they are, because what would be wrong with trying to get better at messaging what you would supposedly want to get across?
Well, John, you were saying earlier that the CNN, MSNBC, what they do is they're in an echo chamber of liberal elites living in a bubble. And look at how they completely missed the strength that Trump had going into 2016. And I predicted if he got the nomination, he would be the president because of the simmering hatred and dissatisfaction among the working class that these media elites had no idea. Most of them are on the East Coast. They talk to each other in their exclusive clubs in the Hamptons and all that, and they have no pulse on what ordinary people are believing, either rightly or wrongly. They have no pulse on what people are thinking. They think everybody thinks like them or should think like them.
Well, Clinton, Hillary, and Obama both insulted great numbers of those people with offhand comments,
Yeah.
derogatory and dismissive comments about them.
Yeah.
And,
The basket of deplorables.
yeah, and you had states that had gone for Obama, sections of those, a number of counties, enough to have beat Trump handily, who switched over to Trump after some of these people had voted for Obama. So just to say that these are just a bunch of dumb racists is not not an accurate assessment of what's going on.
Yeah, no, another Democrat said that you could smell the Trump supporters at Walmart, shopping at Walmart. Yeah, constant comments like that. Here, before I forget, I want to bring this up. Lester Holt, in the past day or so, they show a clip of him interviewing Biden. And Lester Holt, to his credit, although I think he's gone too far along the official narrative, but to his credit this time, he was asking Biden, you first said that that inflation would be transitory, considering how it's continuing and projected to continue for some time. Would you still say it's transitory? Then he said, "Well, I see you're being a bit of a wise guy."
Oh yeah. Yeah, wasn't that something?
Yeah, I mean, wasn't that a reasonable question to ask?
It's a question he couldn't answer.
But again, they're so
They had prepared him for that one.
They're so used to the media giving them softballs that now they're offended and can't handle a real question from a journalist. That happens once in a while.
I think John is right about the Democrats. And you and I have talked about this in our own interviews without John being part of the discussion. And I'll raise it again in that Democrats don't know how to go after the throat. They have never been good at it. The Republicans have turned it into an art form. It started with Willie Horton, and it has never stopped since. They got away with it with Willie Horton, making him Michael Dukakis's running mate, even though there was no truth to that at all. They said, hey, this works. We're going to do this all the time. And it started in. And the Patrick Buchanans and all the other people that were part of that whole entourage in the 80s and 90s decided, hey, we don't have to be truthful. All we have to do is say it often enough and long enough, and people will believe it. And they've been very successful with it.
Which is what the Democrats are doing now, Bryant. The same.
Well, but with no success, though.
With a lot of success so far, now they're pivoting away from it because they see they're not getting traction in the approval ratings. But John and I were talking about even the nomenclature of the Democrats. They're too highfalutin. That they're only talking to people like them, educated intellectuals in their own little bubbles, and they're not talking working class terminology. And that's another reason why they're ineffective. But again, they don't realize that there are working class people who don't talk like them. John, you were talking about that with me earlier.
Yeah. I was listening to some of them last night and was thinking they sound like they're giving a lecture in a seminar in a college when they're giving the news. They brought two black scholars on from Princeton and some other place to talk about some issue, and they had all their credentials there. And then they started talking, and I'm thinking, my God, one abstract, mainly virtue signaling and woke language here and there, but all terminology, fuzzy stuff. It was nothing that would interest a person. It wouldn't even inform them about anything that they would be interested in. I can't remember the topic now, but that's what happens all the time on them.
Yeah.
It's not going to, well, their problem is, of course, as a party, their central committee is not much different from Republicans. There's a lot of really rich people who've been rich all their lives, and they are plugged in to sources of money
Right.
and influence. And even if they lose, nothing bad's going to happen to them.
Let me tell you a story. Let me tell you a story about my sister. She was a United Auto Workers um, international representative. Worked in Detroit for a while, but she was assigned to Region 9A, which is Connecticut. And after she retired from that job for so long, she had been on President Carter's Alcohol Fuels Commission and a number of other things in Washington. So she had a pretty celebrated run. And after she retired, she started taking buses of seniors across the border into Canada as part of her efforts with the Connecticut Senior Citizens Group to take care of lower drug prices for prescriptions. So they'd all get their prescriptions, get on the bus, go to Toronto or Montreal, wherever we're going, and they'd get their prescriptions and come back home. Well, my sister and her husband moved south to get away from the cold. And eventually my sister wound up in Florida after my brother-in-law died. And she is now living in Daytona Beach. And there were a number of senior groups that were active there. And she started doing the same types of things with seniors there that she was doing in Connecticut.
Mm-hmm.
And she thought the pitch to seniors would be identical because they were all retired people, many of whom were from up north. Well, she ran into a buzzsaw of all the retirees who were sitting there on their stock funds and hedge funds looking to see what the market is doing this one day. And she could not, for the life of her, understand the dichotomy of how a senior citizen could not support the programs that were near and dear to Social Security and all the other things that seniors on fixed incomes have to rely on.
Mm-hmm.
So she was a rude awakening for her, and she's still not over it. She's been down there years. So this is part of the problem the Democrats have in Florida. They can't rely on what worked in other Rust Belt states to work in Florida. It ain't happening, baby. And one of the things that the Democrats in Florida have never grasped is this non-connect, this disconnect among the seniors. And I don't think they understand that a lot of those folks down in Florida don't want to hear half of what the Democratic Party is saying. And that's why they don't do so well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, people always vote emotionally. And a lot of these topics that the Democrats are harping on press all kinds of emotional buttons. And that's why they're losing these people who should know better about Social Security and all that. Now, you know, my criticism of Biden and his group is not to give the Republicans a pass. You know, Brian, we've long agreed that, you know, Republicans are very corporate connected, as are the Democrats increasingly now. So, you know, both sides of the aisle have sold out the country to corporations and to China, which is another topic. In order to make that quick upfront buck, they've outsourced both jobs and technology. So China is now a Frankenstein monster of their own creation that's not only out to dominate the West economically, but militarily. It's going to be China's century because of what Biden and Democrats and Republicans have done for the past 20 years. And I don't know if it could be reversed at this point. Do we want world domination by Chinese communists, which is what we're heading to?
I think you're right. I don't know what the solution is going to be, but I will tell you this. When the Battle of Midway was raging in World War II, they were concerned that if they did not prevail in the Pacific, in that zone of operations, that it would be Los Angeles and San Francisco and Seattle where the Japanese would first go ashore and then move from there. The only wrinkle in that theory is that we have enough guns in this country to thwart something like that. And we still do. So I don't think if it's a conventional type of approach, yeah, I think the Chinese would have to think twice about that. If you're talking about nuking our cities, that's a whole different ballgame. But I think there's enough resistance across this country, just as there was in 1941 when we were attacked at Pearl Harbor, to give you the kind of resistance across the country, across the political spectrum, that would be needed to thwart something like that.
Yeah, in fact, supposedly a Japanese general advised against an invasion of the West Coast because of all the guns that Americans.
They knew they couldn't do it.
Yeah,
I don't think the Japanese ever, I don't think the Japanese ever thought they could actually invade the United States.
Yeah.
A lot of those generals, they you know, a lot of them knew they were going to lose. They were just in a desperate, crazy situation, but because of course they'd been denied. The British and Americans had cut them off from fuel sources.
Yeah.
Dramatically.
There was another thing that if you saw the movie The War by Ken Burns, episode 6 starts, and Larry, you can relate to this because the guy they interviewed was from Waterbury, which is Larry's hometown.
Connecticut.
One of the guys that they interviewed was a Jewish soldier from Waterbury, and he was given this job after being injured of overseeing prisoners. And he got to talking with one of the German officers who was in his care, and in perfect English, no accent whatsoever, the German officer said, "Where are you from?" And this guy said, "Well, I'm from the United States." "Where in the United States?" "Connecticut." "What city in Connecticut?" "Waterbury." And the German officer said, "Yes, Waterbury, where the Naugatuck and Mad Rivers come together."
Which means he really knew the.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
And he went on, he says, "How would you know that?" And he said, "Well, I was part of the occupation force. They had this all doped out. They were going to come into this country and take over. And they had every iota of it planned perfectly. So anybody who thinks differently about how they were going to overtake the United States had better think again, because it was probably not feasible, but it didn't stop them from thinking about it."
But I think China is going to be, they could take over without firing a shot. What
Yeah.
they're doing, what's going on now, Taiwan, they're going to push us out of that area. And then we're left with a choice of either going to war with them or just leaving them to that zone of influence. That's their game. We're not going to go to war with China. Conventionally, we can't fight them. There's so many Chinese soldiers. And the other option is going nuclear, which we won't do. So because they're becoming so built up militarily, just that kind of heft in their military is enough to drive us out of those areas. And also they're buying up everything. They're buying up large portions of Australia now, farmland, businesses, and all that. South America. And there's a number of U.S. businesses that they have their hooks into, but that's not generally disclosed. So
Sure.
That buck is what their weapon is. And the Americans are grabbing it. American corporations are grabbing it. Who was it? Was it Stalin that said, "A capitalist will sell you the rope with which to hang him"? In this case, the rope is the lure of Chinese money if we outsource the manufacturing and the technology to China. And the cost is they win on this for some upfront profits on our part. And this trend is continuing. And Biden, by the way, was one of the biggest cheerleaders to get China into the World Trade Organization and give them most favored nation status, which gave them even more of a hands up over American corporations. And now he's saying, "Oh, we're going to reign in China." He enabled all this for the past 20, 30 years.
You know what? If you think back to Jack Welch and General Electric, here's a guy that opened the door wide for that kind of stuff. When he couldn't make General Electric factories profitable in this country, he farmed them out. And a good friend of mine used to be the PR person for General Electric corporate, and his name was Frank Donovan. And he told me once, he said, Jack Welch single-handedly saved this company. And I looked at him and I said, come on, Frank, you could have trained a chimpanzee to do what Jack Welch did to General Electric. And that didn't take any modicum of intelligence and business savvy to do that. Anybody could have farmed it all out abroad to avoid labor costs and reduce increase profit margins by doing so. That doesn't take any talent. And my brother-in-law was a victim of that stuff. He was working at a General Electric plant in Plainville, Connecticut. And one of the things that they did was to parade Jack Welch through there one day. And my brother-in-law got to explain what he was doing in the plating room. And he said, blah, 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 and we're trying to do this because it's cost effective and this doesn't cost the company as much money. And Jack Welch said, good work. And he walked out of the door, and 2 weeks later, they closed that plant.
Yeah. Every manufacturer in the country.
You know, and you know, that's not a fluke, as you know.
Yeah, and who enabled all that, Brian? The politicians on both sides of the island who have their funding from these big corporations. So the politicians did nothing to stem the flow of that.
I agree.
There is no party.
I think,
we don't have a party that represents the interest of working people. You know, in Western Europe, one reason they have they still have more unions percentage-wise. Their populace is more in unions than they are here by double or triple the percentage points. Ours is so low because we have stripped powers. We prevent people. We prevent workers from having strong unions. And that's one reason there's inequality that's increased compared with any country in Western Europe. It's increased here more drastically because they have labor parties and other things that actually represent them and can fight and can affect the formation of the national government.
Yeah,
more than we can. Ours is nothing. Ours is hamstrung. A union can't do this. It's hard to even organize a union. So and it's hard for unions to support each other. You can't strike and support. You can't. There are so many limitations here, and we're paying the price for it. That the people of the United States are paying a big price because they've been shunned, out of politics. If you're with the big money people, there's almost nothing for you to do in politics but vote for Trump or a non-Trump just as an expression of your passion and your anxiety or your fear, your insecurity, but your own interests, your own economic interests. There's no path for you to fight for it. Bernie Sanders was the closest they came, and you can see what the Democrats did with him. I believe they could have won with Bernie. I still believe it.
But Brian has a different viewpoint on Bernie Sanders, Brian.
Well, I perhaps he could have won the White House if he had cemented himself better within the Democratic Party.
Well, the party's not going to take him. The party's not going to. Their party doesn't have people in it who would even say what he was doing was the right thing, even though it's for healthcare, education, labor rights. They don't have the Democratic Party build back better. These Madison Avenue type terms that don't mean they're contentless. And you have a guy like Joseph Robinette. Whenever I see that they took the Robinette in, I think, I don't read it, but his son becomes filthy rich, not able to speak a word of the language, and someone's going to pay this guy hundreds of thousands of dollars a month. How does that not smell like corruption right off the bat? It stinks to high heaven, obviously.
Yeah, it does.
And Biden himself has been cut in on deals, and not just Biden, of course. We know that there's just the numbers of politicians. They go in and maybe they're making, their wealth might be 150,000, and they come out and they're worth $70 million or something like that. That's politics.
Well, look at Manchin with the coal industry. There's a perfect example.
Yeah.
And nobody is offended by that except me, maybe. And you're right. I think it's a bum situation, and
not going to get better.
It's not going to get better. And to finish on Bernie Sanders, if I tell Larry that if Bernie Sanders wanted the Democratic nomination for president twice, he should have become a Democrat at least, rather than remaining an independent. I mean,
Well, if you were a
walk-
Democrat, a party central committee, and if you wanted him to come in and join you, don't you think that you could have induced him to do that
I don't
by
know.
saying you're going to back him?
I don't know. I don't know what went on behind the closed doors. I do know that if you walked into the Republican National Committee headquarters and said, I want the nomination for president, but I'm not going to join your party, they'd laugh you out the door. You know,
Well,
and
Trump was not a Republican before. He was giving money all over the place.
And they tried to show him the door, and it was only voters that gave him an option.
They sure hopped on. Once they knew that they had somebody who could attract voters, they knew how to get on that horse.
That's right. I agree.
Yeah, they got on that horse. But there are Democrats out there, and there's the woman from either the Dakotas or some. I've seen her several times on the news programs. She was a senator or a governor for there. She's a regular, fine, progressive, straight-talking American politician. The Democrats don't give. There's several of them in their party. They don't give them the time of day.
Yeah.
They are nowhere in the party. The guy from Montana, the
Tester.
Fine politician. Even the guy from the state of Washington, the governor. These are people who could go out anywhere in the country, farmland, factories, get out, talk to people. They have a vision about supporting people. They're true, because I don't think populist is a bad word in my book, that they have a popular touch, and they're interested in people. The Democrat Party has no use for them. They're not from that, Ivy League, well-heeled, snooty outfit.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's a lot of truth there, and I don't know what the solution is for the party itself. Of course, the Republicans are still reeling from losses from Trump. My guess is Republicans will find a way to coalesce faster than the Democrats do, and keep the eye on 2024, which is what the Democrats are not doing right now.
Yeah, again, it's become, both parties have become too attached to the corporate money, to special interests. Nancy Pelosi, a case in point recently, they're trying to reform that now so they can't make big investments on legislation that affects their investments. And the same thing with the Federal Reserve. But, if they do pass it, they're going to find ways to get around it. So, I mean, everybody is there to improve their own financial situation and their own careers rather than serving the public. Now, I think politics has always been that way. It's always been corrupt. However, because of the evolution of the corporate structure and grip of the corporations and big money and special interests, it has now become at a higher level than before. After Teddy Roosevelt went with his trust busting legislation, he was able to rein them in for a while, but that now it's back in full force. And again, I don't see any way that they're going to break their grip on that. We're headed towards more and more. Again, I call it fascism because the definition of fascism is the merger of corporate and state interests. It's not socialism, not communism.
Especially the military accumulation of capital is also important. The militarists get in. You get this war hysteria, and war as a project to make money, which is becoming.
Well, don't forget, it was Eisenhower, 4-star general, Republican, a staunch Republican, who had the Normandy invasion, who warned in his speech, his farewell address when he was leaving the presidency, about the military-industrial complex. And how many years ago was that? And how much more has it been strengthened since then?
Like privatizing the army, the military. Now is using not just mercenaries, but now they're going to using these private companies.
Yeah, that's
boy.
That's
Yeah.
that's one of the ways Rome fell, by the way, when they
Yes,
started
indeed.
using I'm
Yeah.
a kind of a history buff. I see more and more parallels with the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. That's what's going on now in the United States.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. We have a very bad situation.
Well, wrapping it up now, guys. None of us see a solution, right?
No, but I will say, your city, Waterbury, I used to be in, I went to school in Massachusetts, but I used to drive by there on the way back and forth a lot. That was a really beautiful town. It's in the 60s.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, just to see it going by the waterfront area, those buildings were gorgeous buildings.
The clock tower, the railroad clock tower. That's a replica of the Italian clocks tower in Siena, classical architecture.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, the neighborhoods were the ethnic neighborhoods back then were intact, a strong working class. People didn't lock their doors. From my friends still remaining in Waterbury now, from the reports I'm getting from them, it's all gone to hell now. Yeah, Waterbury
oh
is
yeah,
today.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But just physically, yeah, it was a gorgeous place. The setting
Yeah.
and everything about it.
But there is hope. If you think back to what happened with Lawrence and Lowell, Massachusetts, two more industrial cities that really were on the skids.
Yeah.
Regentrification has worked in those cities. Is it perfect? Of course not. But they've taken deserted factory buildings and turned them into combination living and commercial operations rather than what the rats take over. And that's been done to the betterment of the town's grand list. There's more activity, there's more jobs. Is the drug problem still rampant in Lawrence and Lowell? Of course. It's not going to go away overnight, but at least you give people an option for a life that's better than the gutter.
Okay, the argument against that among liberals would be that you've driven out the underclass by gentrification. What happened to the working class and the underclass in Lawrence and Lowell when the gentrification happened?
Well, they always made an effort, especially with the Hispanic population, which was very big in Lawrence and still is. They always made an effort to include the minorities in the big picture. Did it always work? Did they always think they were being included? Of course not. No one has a panacea for all of this. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And that's what they have done in Lowell and Lawrence. And to their credit, some of it has worked. If you look at some of the cities, Scranton, for instance, Waterbury, for instance, Bridgeport, those cities have not tried any of that to any large degree, and they've got the decay to prove it.
But with the economy the way it is, and the outsourcing, is there a way to turn that around now? Is there any way to support that kind of a revival in terms?
Not with the Pentagon. The bipartisan support to give the Pentagon hundreds, 700 billion or whatever, even beyond what they asked.
Yeah,
you can't. There's only so much money. You can't rebuild the country if you've given the Pentagon all that stuff. Because what it's doing is not really rebuilding the country whatsoever.
Yeah.
There's no two ways about it. They could really. I mean, it would need such spending here. It would need such a patriotic spirit, I think, that is lacking, because they should be caring about their fellow Americans' well-being first, and not this vainglorious stuff. We're going to be a unipolar world, and we're going to be the rulers of the universe, and all that kind of fantasy of these Kissinger and Brzezinski and all these ones that are plugged with the corporations and the energy industries. They're gonna wipe us out. We're gonna be all of our wealth as the country is going to go into this kind of a thing.
Yeah,
because,
you and I may not live to see it, but it's coming. I think you're right.
Yeah, I was looking the other day. because they were saying, oh, there are the black kids, maybe 67% of black youth live in either poor or very poor neighborhoods. Some
Yep.
studies came out, and a huge number of meaning their life chances for education and jobs very low. So I did the figures. I wonder, well, what about white kids? When I looked at how many white kids there are in the country, maybe the rate was 17% versus 67. But when you get to the numbers of people, they both had about the same number of kids, 7 million or so. 7 million black kids, 7 million white kids. So, okay, sure, we know that the black community has it worse in this country for various historical reasons. However, a lot of people aren't telling the white people, this is not kind of Hispanics and others who've got their levels of poverty, but a whole bunch of white people stand to benefit from the right kind of programs. But everyone thinks, oh, these benefit programs are just going to go to black people. And the Democrats and others, they permit this illusion. So what it means is that the 7 million white kids are ignored. They're ignored as if they don't exist. Their problems don't exist. No one's addressing them. And I think that's why those communities are vulnerable to Trump and other kinds of stuff that's against their own interests.
That's right.
Because no one's speaking up for them. It's still the same number of kids, 7 million.
Well, again, Biden and his crew, it's constantly equity. Now, it used to be equality, but that's been replaced by equity. And, which means you give a disadvantaged group an unequal advantage over whites.
Yeah, you pit people against each other.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. The Democrats, if they were smart, would be saying this affects both black and white kids.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that because they're so attached to their perception that to stay in power, they have to pander to all these minority groups. They're not sincere about helping minorities. It's a political technique on their part.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree 100%.
Well, Brian, do you?
And of course, you have the people. There's money in going along with them. Then you're going to become the spokesman for the black this or black that, and there will be a salary and a foundation and plugged in. So it begets its own kind of parasitic structure. And those people, I mean, look at the communities. How could you say this is working when my whole life I've seen it getting worse and worse for poor people?
Yeah.
Especially black ones. It's gotten worse and worse. So what you're doing obviously isn't working. Why would you figure out if it's not working? What's wrong with it?
Yeah, that's a good point. Since the beginning of the civil rights movement, there were some advances then. We seem to be heading in the right direction, but look at the deterioration over the past 50 years. Things have gotten worse. How come?
Yes, indeed. Why? Indeed. I was in Mississippi in '64 when it was, it was a hairy situation. Well, we went back 25 years later to the same. This was where Fannie Lou Hamer was in Ruleville. It was sadder than it was in '64.
Imagine that. Yeah.
Well, unemployment, just people just rotting on the bone.
Yeah.
Much of the area, there's no jobs. The schools were, they hadn't gotten any better. They were worse. And then, of course, you had the drug gangs and stuff coming through. The same thing in my hometown in Michigan, though. Hometown right across the lake from Chicago.
Yeah.
Completely, half of it's boarded up.
So how the hell did all this happen, and where the hell did all that money go?
Man, I'll tell you,
billions of dollars spent over the past half century, supposedly to improve conditions. What happened?
The fat cats got fatter and richer. We can see that.
Yeah.
But as you said, Rome and other places, Spain went down with its overreaching.
Yeah.
And you're gonna rule the world. And the interior's rotted out.
Yeah, and all the staunch, basic, fundamental principles that founded the beginnings of these empires, the hard work, the dedication, the social cohesion, once they became empires, it all became special interest oriented, it all became money oriented. Those values fell apart, and then the empires finally fell apart as well. Same pattern over and over.
Unfortunately, they got nuclear weapons now.
Exactly. That sounds like a topic for our next. We went all over the place, but I think we brought up some good points on the right subjects.
All right.
Once again, thanks for joining us, John Woodford and Bryant Thomas and myself, Larry Sparano, and everybody out there. We hope you enjoyed this episode. We'll see you soon. Bye now.
Yep. See ya.
Bye-bye.